Lisa, thanks for making time to talk to me. It's a real pleasure, Lisa Scriven, to speak to you. You're now in Namibia, I think. You can tell us a bit about that in a minute. But the reason I wanted to speak to you is I was and am extremely passionate about free trade, fair trade tourism in South Africa, which I think is now just known as fair trade tourism. I was passionate about it because for me, it is one of the few certification schemes that actually says more than it's just a certificate. It's very clear in what it says, and there's a clear social commitment in the idea of fair trade. So I'm hoping that you're going to enlighten me as to why you've run into a few local difficulties with fair trade tourism. So I think it's extremely important that it continues in existence. But could you just explain to me why you think fair trade tourism has run into a few local difficulties?
Thanks, Harold, and thanks for having me today. It's a pleasure to have a chat with you about it. I've actually been working with fair trade tourism on and off for almost 15 years now. So I've seen it go through, a lot of good times, bad times, larger numbers, regional, scaling back, scaling up. So yeah, I think I can speak about this. COVID, of course, is a factor, but I think I can speak about this outside of a COVID context in terms of the challenges the organization faces. Historically, fair trade tourism has been quite dependent on donor funding, which, is wonderful and allows you to do a lot of projects and training, etc. I think like any nonprofit organization, however, it makes you focus less on operating like a business. So that's been a significant challenge, is that now going from a position where we had plenty of financial capacity, that's now all but disappeared. So we now have to reinvent. And we've been going through extensive consultations with our clients about what that should look like. So we're using tech, we're making things very lean. Like everyone else in the world, we're doing remote offices, etc. So we've pared things back, but really reformulated to address, really, it's a financial constraint. Okay, and it's not only operationally, but then you're faced with challenges. For example, if we were to be, I'm not sure if you're aware, but we were one of the first certification programs to be recognized by the Global Sustainable Tourism Council. And unfortunately, we weren't able to maintain that strictly because of financial constraints. It's just not feasible that we can afford those kind of annual fees to gain that recognition. Yet we're pressured by the industry to do so. So who would pay that? It would be the little businesses that, like you say, we have a very strong social footprint in the region. And it's a lot of the businesses that are certified by FTT are family-owned businesses, independent, community-owned, rural, businesses that were historically marginalized in historically marginalized communities. And to pass on a big bill like that to them is just it's not something we can do.
And Lisa, what was generating that big bill? What was causing the big bill?
The big bill, you mean for the GSTC recognition?
Well, there's the GSTC recognition, and then there's presumably the things that GSTC recognition required that you do.
Yeah, one of the big things is, of course, the auditing, which is meant to be third party. So you have an independent audit, which is best practice. FTT has internally done audits, outsourced, had an independent panel. We've had a lot of different structures, but the GSTC does require that those be independent. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with the capacity in this part of the world, but the requirements for auditors that they stipulate, that's extremely hard to find. And we've had a lot of less than ideal experiences with external auditors in the past, not only with capacity challenges. They might be great auditors, but they don't know tourism, for example, or they don't understand context. What's the cultural dynamic? So fair trade tourism is considered, the expert in these fields, yet we have to outsource the technical component of what we do. So yeah, that's a very tricky thing. And if you do find someone that has that capacity, expertise, you're looking at someone with at least a decade of experience, whose daily fees are obviously going to be very high. And again, that just confounds the challenges related to finance.
One of the things, Lisa, that's always worried me about the GSTC system is the notion of it being a global set of criteria, which kind of ignores both local geography and climate, but more importantly, probably, it ignores the cultural context. And obviously in South Africa, post-apartheid in particular, but in other parts of Africa as well, then all those relationships post-colonial society are of critical importance, and yet GSTC doesn't really acknowledge that at all, does it?
Yeah, I think they've made significant efforts in terms of trying to make the criteria open, but there is always a subtlety that doesn't quite fit in, you know, the square peg in the round hole kind of a thing. So we do struggle with that. And sometimes, you know, you can find that a business is simply trying to jump through a hoop in order to get through the hoop, as opposed to actually doing something meaningful that matters. And that's not, I don't really think is the goal of sustainable and responsible tourism, certainly not of fair trade tourism.
It's certainly not the goal of responsible tourism, and it's one of the major differentiators, I think, between responsible tourism and sustainable tourism. Can I just push you a little on the consequences of having now global certification? Because presumably it's meant you face competition in Africa from other companies which are perhaps better funded.
Absolutely. In fact, it's interesting, in the early days of the GSTC, Fair Trade Tourism was part of a consultation with other certification programs on the continent in terms of, you know, where do we stand, benchmarking, etc. And although everyone was very keen, they were in similar positions, that it was more important to focus on socioeconomic development at a local level than to gain that global recognition. So unfortunately, what's happened to many of those bodies and to us is the more powerful global certification schemes do come in as competitors. And oftentimes those receive co-funding from government agencies in their headquarter countries. We simply can't compete. I mean, we can operate as lean as possible, but they have scale, they have finance, we have impact, we have the story, we have an incredible collection of businesses that are incredibly inspiring. But when it comes to the audit side, the technical requirement that we have to comply with, we can't compete. And it's sad.
And I would want to question whether the other labels take as seriously the socioeconomic dimensions of what constitutes responsible tourism in the way that I know fair trade tourism did.
Yeah, I think there are two things that concern me. One is exactly what you're saying about the social context. And what are you actually communicating to the traveler? Are you communicating what this impact is, or are you communicating the stamp? I'll just leave that open as a question.
Well, can I push you on that, Lisa, if I may? Because it seems to me one of the things we said was different about responsible tourism way back in 2002 in Cape Town was the notion of it being a meaningful connection. And the problem for me is that the label fair trade tourism, with or without the South Africa bit, is the South Africa bit added the kind of post-apartheid, but okay, we're a long way past apartheid now, although the consequences live on. And fair trade tourism has expanded beyond South Africa. So fair enough, the name has changed, I accept that. But there's still a pretty strong ethical component in the notion of fair trade, isn't there? And it seems to me, therefore, it has meaning in a way that being gold certified GSTC, I don't even know what that means technically. It certainly carries no meaning for me. And that was driven home the last time I was in Cape Town, when I wanted to find out which hotels were the most water efficient, because I'd arrived in the middle of the serious drought in Cape Town, and I couldn't find out. I couldn't find out because it was just a label that said they were green. No idea what that means. But the hotel I was staying in had actually done very little more, so far as I could tell, than simply remove the bath plugs from the bath. That was the limit of what they'd done, and yet they're still certified. I couldn't work it out.
Yeah, I think part of what you're saying is the story. I think a lot of businesses are very, they don't really know how to package the responsible tourism, fair trade tourism story. they still see it as it's compartmentalized as opposed to part of the experience. And I think that's something that's a role that fair trade tourism can play in terms of strengthening that. And I think what you say raises a very valid point about, global certification bodies is because they have to train local auditors on a standard that wasn't developed for local context necessarily, it becomes a tick box. And so you do what it requires to tick the box. And I think where fair trade tourism has differed over the years and continues to differ is that the developmental side of the business support is extremely important. We're focusing now as we restructure the way forward on really helping businesses to network with each other. So it's not only about learning from us, because that's not sustainable, but we're putting together a lot of networking events and online webinars. And we've discussed even looking at peer checks. So as an interim audit, not audit, but an interim check, that they would visit another business with like a five-point thing to verify. And we really think that can help to really build relationships and help each other grow in a meaningful way. And I'm not sure that any other certification program would invest to that extent.
Do you think it would make any difference to the fair trade tourism label if it wasn't GST certified?
I don't think it makes a difference to the local market. Certainly doesn't to our clients. We have canvassed them on that, and that is absolutely not a factor for them. I think where the difficulty comes in is the travel trade is starting to demand. So if you have the big buyers that require that you be certified by a GSTC recognized scheme, then that's where the competition can just come in and give a stamp, and fair trade is at a disadvantage.
So yet another example of the big companies driving out the smaller suppliers. Yeah,
it's sad. And I mean, if you look within the principles of responsible tourism and fair trade tourism, it's about promoting and supporting small and local. So we're all being a bit hypocritical in this certification game sometimes.
Well, maybe that's an issue which responsible tourism needs to take up more generally, Lisa. I don't think fair trade tourism should be left to face that on its own, if I'm honest. I wanted to ask you about your experience of different ways of managing the auditors. Are you convinced in your own mind that by using third-party external auditors, the quality of the auditing is necessarily higher than it would be if you used your own in-house auditors?
Well, I think the opposite is true. I think the quality of the auditing is inferior. And I'd say that unequivocally. I mean, with all of the different structures we've used, the auditing, the process itself, no, it's far inferior. Internal auditing was definitely superior, and it was deemed as far more valuable to all of the clients. Of course, it's not independent, so it's
not independent, but it is accountable. There is somebody holding that person accountable for their work. Whereas with the independent auditors, there's very little accountability most of the time. So.
And even when fair trade tourism did the audits internally, there was always the requirement to have substantiating evidence. So, it wasn't just oh, they had nice coffee, so I can tick off a couple more boxes. There was always the requirement to have the evidence. And definitely the audits were superior for all involved. The feedback was better, the development of the business was better, the subsequent audit was always better because they got the feedback they needed. And yes, there was a gray area between development and audit, but it was a gray area we were okay with navigating at the time.
Yeah, and presumably, I mean, it's perhaps the final question I want to ask you, Lisa, and it's me raising this, not you. It does seem to me that GSTC is obsessed by the process, and as you put it, the tick boxes. A lot of the emphasis is on the inputs, but what we don't see, and it's what I think really needs to be changed in the way certification works, is we don't see any emphasis on the outcome or the impacts. Everything is concerned with the internal process. There's no concern about what the external outcome and the impacts are. And that's typified by not being able to find out which hotels consume the least water per bed night, for example, or which hotels pay the staff best. You can't find that out from the certificates as they currently stand. And yet those are things which would be meaningful to consumers.
And there's a real opportunity in that too, in that it could even further empower the businesses to be able to tell their story, because they see what the impact is and they're required to formulate it. So yeah, there are a lot of advantages to putting the focus on the impact as opposed to the process. Yeah, fair.
One of the things that frustrates me about the Responsible Tourism Awards, which I am very proud of, but nonetheless, you know, we find people doing special work to apply for the awards because they say we demand a lot of evidence. But people are not, they're still not putting that evidence out there in the public domain. And somehow we need to be encouraging people to work together on that. And perhaps, Lisa, that's a way in which the responsible tourism movement could work with fair trade tourism to actually help people to understand how to use that information for their market advantage and to share with the communities and their suppliers. Perhaps that would be something useful that could come out of this conversation.
Absolutely. We'd be very open to that because it's very much aligned with where we see the value in the work that we do at Fair Trade Tourism.
Lisa, as we come to the end, is there anything else you want to add?
Gosh, no, Harold, but I do, you know, a lot of people talk about building back better, and I do think we're at a pivotal point in the game of certification as well. And I think it's an opportunity to talk about how we unite for sustainability. We had, in commemoration of Human Rights Day today, in fact, yes, one of our ministers was saying in the context of COVID is that rising alone is not sustainable. So maybe that's something that we need to actually take to heart very seriously in the context of certification.
I think one of the things that's very clear about responsible tourism practice around the world is that whilst there are many individual businesses doing remarkable things, if I'm honest, the bigger impacts come where you see a number of businesses working with the destination to make a really significant difference. And you see that in Kerala, you see it in Barcelona. But sadly, there are not yet that many examples where you see groups of businesses in a particular place coming together to work with the local community. But perhaps, Lisa, that's somewhere where responsible tourism and fair trade tourism could work together. And I'd certainly look forward to that opportunity if we can pull that off between us. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon.